All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today over Zoom. It's really fun to have these things, and thank you so much for braving daylight savings time, where it looks like it should be 11:30 outside. So I'm Caitlin Donnelly. I'm a museum specialist here at the Birmingham Museum, and my presentation tonight is on Washington Willits and the moral treatment movement. Um, so just some content notes up front. I will be talking about mental illness and mental disability using the terms that were used at the time in legal and social contexts. And these terms are not used in those contexts anymore, nor are they used colloquially. So just putting that up front. And even though, mental health care throughout the 1800s was kind of the stuff of haunted houses and like ghost type shows when they have their Halloween specials, when they go to old abandoned asylums. There were some bright spots along the way. And the story of Washington Willits really helps us kind of view that bright spot in its proper context. And so with that out of the way, I promise that my entire presentation won't be a super bummer, but we do have to start on a kind of a bummer note, if I can progress my slides. There we go. So a couple years back, we here at the museum came across this article in the Detroit Free Press, April 22nd, 1851, issue of the Detroit Free Press. And we were really looking for stories from Birmingham told from outside perspectives and kind of searching for some of the bigger names in the history of Birmingham, one of which was the Willits family. And so this article reads, quote, "A few days since Mr. E. Willits, who resides in Birmingham, Oakland County, who was on his way from the Utica Insane Asylum, having charge of his son, a lad of 18 years, who had lately been discharged from that institution as incurable, stepped out at a station on the Central Rail line of the railroad through New York to obtain some refreshments for the lad, leaving him sitting quietly on his seat. On returning, Mr. Willits found the train in motion and got into the car behind the one which he had left. Here he found an acquaintance, with whom he conversed for a minute or two, and then passed the car in which he left his son. On reaching it, he found the seat vacant, and the poor boy gone. Upon making inquiry, the conductor told him that he had put a young man off the train some distance back, who would not pay his fare nor give an account of himself. The anxious father stopped at the next station, returned, and found the mangled body of his son lying on the track. He had paid his own fare and that of his son to Buffalo. And so, fairly short article. There's a lot to unpack here, not the least of which is all those run-on sentences. Like English teachers right now are laughing, crying, throwing up. But one of the really interesting points that I found reading this article, you read a lot of historical accounts, especially in my profession, and it gets a little demoralizing sometimes just how poorly people from various minorities are treated just in the press, whether it be religious, ethnic minorities, anything like that. I'm going to admit some people from the waiting room. There we are. And it's kind of heartening just how sympathetic the writer of this article is, not only towards Washington Willits, but also towards the Willits family. Hey folks, can you mute yourselves when you come in, please? Thank you. So I found that really fascinating too. And so this brings up a lot of different questions. So who was Washington Willits? What was the mental illness that, his family was taking him to this place to treat? And what might that treatment have looked like back in the day? So to answer the first question, we can look at who Washington Willits was. And luckily, we found him in the 1850 census. And the 1850 census is really, really interesting. It's our first modern census in that it records the names of everyone in the household, their occupations, and their ages. In censuses before this, you would have the male householder's name and then check marks after that for like sex and like ranges of age. So if you knew kind of who you were looking for, you could reasonably find them. But sometimes it was just like, yo, there's this guy named John Smith, and there's 8 people in his house, and one of them's under 5. Who knows? Who knows who that person is? So this one we can actually see. So this on the bottom here is the census record. And from this, we can see some really key things. So this is E. Willits. We are fairly certain this is Elijah Willits, one of the first 4 landowners in Birmingham who bought land along the Saginaw Trail at the midway point between Detroit and Pontiac. And I have a map here that kind of shows where those land claims were. So Elijah Willits, Washington's father, is amongst the first 4 landowners. And then underneath we have R. Willits, Rachel Willits, Elijah's second wife. And at the bottom we have a W. Willits, and that is Washington Willits. He is a male, he's 26 years old. And at the far right here, in this yellow box, we have deranged. So we can kind of break that down. Washington is a little bit older than the newspaper report said he was. In the previous newspaper story, it says he was a lad of 18, whereas on the census report, it states his age as 26. Now, something about the censuses at this time is the enumerator, or the person actually taking the census, was in charge of writing this all down. A lot of times they might ask the person how old they were, what their profession was, but the numerator was the one writing everything down. So sometimes you might have to take things with a little bit of a grain of salt because this is coming through a third party. This isn't someone self-identifying in any of these ways. So if we look a little bit closer, it looks like Elijah and Rachel Willits married in 1829. So Washington is probably the son of Elijah Willits and Catherine Bailey Willits. Catherine was Elijah's first wife, and she was a twice widowed tavern owner in Detroit. After the War of 1812, and they eventually, when they moved to the area that would become Birmingham, they opened up their own tavern. But Catherine dies in about 1822, and she and Elijah have 2 sons, Wellington and Washington. Catherine really liked W historical names. So that might actually make Washington Willits a little bit older. It might make him around 27 or 28 if he was Catherine's youngest son here. And so let's break down this deranged here, because that is also an outlier in the 1850 census. So in this column, the census enumerator, the person taking the census, was asked if the person in the household was, quote, whether deaf and dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or convict. And obviously deranged is not one of those choices. So there was a lot of, oh, there's another person in the waiting room that I'm going to admit. So when it came to recording a person's occupation in the census, the enumerator had written instructions as to how to determine, was someone a tailor, what sort of tailor they were, what sort of manufacturer, and all that. They did not have any written instructions as to this column and how to determine whether someone was insane or idiotic. So this leads to some strangeness, as you might expect. So obviously we have this census enumerator just totally freestyling and using their own terminology. And in the 1840 and 1850 census is the first time that we see this question of, is this person mentally disabled or dealing with mental illness? And some enumerators are letting their bigoted flag fly. In the 1840 census, basically this information is considered worthless by historians because a lot of the enumerators were marking down every single free person of color as insane. So for anyone out there doing genealogy projects on their own family, particularly if your family includes free people of color in this time period, and you see insane or idiotic in this column in either the 1840 or the 1850 census, feel free to take this with a grain of salt, or a rock of salt, or a Dwayne the Rock Johnson of salt, if you will. But, let's say for funsies, how would we define between idiotic or insane in the 1850s? So let's take a little sidebar and look at that. So in general, in this time period, the designation and the line between insane and idiotic it's basically going to be really subjective and between physician to physician. But in general, broadly speaking, insane refers to a periodic condition of unusual behavior. So something like, what we might say today, like seasonal depression or perhaps BPD. Idiotic, in general, broad statement, could refer to a permanent learning disability. Insanity was considered curable, whereas idiocy was not. So moving forward during this time period, when asylums are really focusing on curing people of their mental illness or mental disability, they are only going to be admitting insane people. And again, depending on which institution or facility you were going to, there was really no line. Two people with what today we would consider equal diagnoses one might be considered insane and thus admitted to an asylum, and another person seeing another doctor might be called idiotic. And then deranged was just a free-for-all. Anything and anyone could fall under that category. And the photo on the left here on the slide is what the United States population looks like in 1850. So as you can see, very few people are living west of the Mississippi at this time, but there's a huge westward expansion. And that's why the census of this era is really opening up, and we really want to find more information about the population in the United States, not just how many people we have, but what are the state of their mental health, what occupation are they in, and all these other things. And the photo or the illustration that I have here is basically, a nice nostalgic look at what taking the census might have looked like during the time period. And so here I have the census of 1850 from the US government, and we are looking at how many people in Michigan and nationally were deemed to be either insane or idiotic, just for funsies, just so we can really get a sense of how many people were alive during that time period and how many people might have been deemed to have mental health issues. So the US population in 1850 was about 23 million, and that is an increase of almost 36% over 1840. The population of Michigan in the 1850 census is almost 400,000. So if we look down to Michigan and we look at white folks, which Washington did fit that definition, we have about 54 people who were counted as insane on the census, and about 92 who were counted as idiotic. So nationwide, we have about almost 15,000 in each category nationwide. That fall under either of those categories. And of course, Deranged was not something that was officially counted, so we don't know how many census enumerators counted people in the same way that they categorized Washington Willits. So that should be the end of Washington Willits' story in 1850, right? He's living at home with his mom and his stepmom and some brothers and sisters. Well, my colleague Donna Cassiselli found a second census record. And this is from the Pontiac County Jail. And it lists Washington Willits, who is a 26-year-old male, who is a farmer in the Oakland County Jail or the Pontiac County Jail. And on the condition column, where before he was listed as deranged, he is now listed as assault. Because remember that last choice that the enumerator had was, is this person a pauper? Are they a convict? So we see the other men who are also in the county jail with him. We have larceny, we have another assault, we have perjury, and we have arson under the list of what these people were in for. So this brings up even more questions. And Donna and I went into the newspaper accounts and we're like, okay, well, how did he get in the jail? Is there a newspaper article that we can find that talks about what he was in for and possibly like how long he was there and any other information that we can find about this young man? And what we found just like thickens the plot that much more, because we find this letter to the editor of the Oakland Gazette on July 6th, 1850. And it reads, quote, "To the editor of the Oakland Gazette, Sir, permit me, through the columns of your newspaper, to inquire of the prosecuting attorney or sheriff, presuming they know, why it is, and on what grounds, a man by the name of Willett from Birmingham is kept in jail at public charge to the county. I have been informed that Willett has spells of being insane, and that for some threat made by him, during one of these aberrations of mind, his parents, or someone of his family who reside at Birmingham and are reported to be well off in pecuniary matters, made a complaint against him, and by some process got him put into jail. If the said Willett has committed any offense against the public peace of society, and for which he stands indicted, and for which his state of mind would not protect him from a fair trial in one of the courts of the county, it is very well. But on the other hand, if by trick of legerdemain he is thrust into jail designedly to have him supported at the public defense, it is quite another and a different thing." So again, way too many run-on sentences here. But basically what this person is saying is like, hey, I have questions about why this guy is in jail. I can't find any information about why he is. His family's well off. Are they just passing the buck when it comes to his upkeep? So that is like super interesting. And that is basically the only thing we can find that states that Washington Willits was in the Pontiac County Jail. And obviously that leads to a whole lot more questions. And unfortunately, there is no follow-up in the Oakland Gazette, nor really does the Willett name appear in the Oakland Gazette in any other way that can help shed any light into this issue. So now we have another wrinkle in that case. And even before we found this article or this second census report, I was already thinking back to another instance of someone with some mental health issues in early Birmingham, and that is the story of Emery Fish. Many of you might undoubtedly be familiar with the story of the murders of Polly and Cynthia Utter. We've done several talks in the past about it, and we do have a podcast episode where we kind of dive into the life of Emery Fish and this crime. But basically, the too long didn't read version of it is in April 1825, Emery Fish, in a quote, state of derangement, murders Polly Utter, who was 44 at the time, and her daughter Cynthia, who was 13. This is the first major crime in Oakland County and the first murders tried in the Oakland County court system. Emery was found not guilty, basically by reason of insanity. The official documents read that, quote, he did not have the fear of God before his eyes. And this would have really set the stage. People, even 25 years later, would have remembered this, would have been talking about it. Basically, we have Greenwood Cemetery because of it. They would have gone past this monument to the Utter family, in their day-to-day life. And my boss and director of the Birmingham Museum, Leslie Pilak, composed this map on the left here to really show where people were living and where the land claims were at the time of the Utter murders. So the blue dotted line that is going kind of from the lower right to the upper left, that is the Saginaw Trail. Nowadays we know it as Woodward Avenue. And that yellow dot, or that yellow square, is where we believe the Utter cabin was, where the murders were committed. And if you go down the Saginaw Trail a little bit, you'll see that the Willits family lived very, very close. So Elijah Willits would have been alive at that time, and also he would have had his sons Wellington and Washington living with him. And just like, today we have some cases that happened in 1970s of kids being abducted, and that changes basically how kids are brought up for generations afterwards. This might have very well changed how Washington was treated by his friends and family. If he was, as the letter writer to the Oakland Gazette claims, having spells of insanity, was this reminding people of the spells of insanity that Emery Fish had displayed before the murders? Was the family concerned about themselves or their neighbors? Or, as the letter writer suggests, were they merely just trying to pass the buck for, the care and keeping of their son? So let's take a look at if Washington Willits had been admitted to the Utica Insane Asylum. And again, the timeline is pretty tight, sometime between July 6th, 1850 and April 1851, he may or may not have sought treatment at the Utica State Insane Asylum. I think there might be a case to be made that maybe Elijah and Washington went to Utica, New York, to the Utica Insane Asylum, and perhaps he was not admitted because maybe they deemed him to be idiotic or incurable instead of insane, incurable, or maybe he did spend several months at the facility. I just want to be very, very clear that I cannot prove in any way that he was treated at the Utica Insane Asylum. But if he was, let's take a look at the moral treatment movement and the Utica Insane Asylum and look at the ways that Washington may have been treated for his mental illness. So the moral treatment movement starts with the guy in this portrait here. His name is Philippe Pinel, and he is regarded as the father of the moral treatment movement. He is basically living before, through, and after the French Revolution. And before the revolution, he loses a friend. His friend is described as going through a, quote, mania and complete suicide. And Philippe sees this as this terrible tragedy that did not need to happen. And it occurred because he was not treated well by the medical establishment at the time. So Philippe starts applying to work in various sanatorias throughout France. And
Hey,
after the
I'm listening to
revolution, he ends
meeting
up
about this.
at oops, I am going ahead of myself, but he ends up basically at the Bicêtre Hospital, and he is working with 4,000 inmates. And 200 of these inmates are there because they are suffering from some form of, again, what was called insanity at the time. And he works really closely with these patients. He is writing detailed case notes, and he basically stops the what had been going on before, these treatments that was basically blistering, purging, and bleeding, because he sees that these aren't having any effects on these individuals. And in fact, what could help these individuals more than bleeding them every day is unchaining them. Many of these individuals were spending their entire incarceration chained to walls, not having the freedom of movement. So he really advocates more of a personalized, individualized care. And this movement hits American shores in the 1830s, and it really starts this mania for building asylums, many of them at taxpayer expense. People really see this as, wow, in this new system where we're actually treating people like human beings and not violent animals, we can cure people of these mental illnesses, of this insanity, through kindness, through sympathy, through getting people outdoors in a rural environment and getting them to like appreciate nature and things like that. And it's really pushing back against the depictions of the mentally ill that was in the newspapers and literature of the early 1800s and 1700s, which was the mentally ill as inherently violent or lazy or animal-like. And the Utica Insane Asylum becomes a flagship institution in the United States for the moral treatment movement. And the institution is founded in 1843. And again, I'm talking about Utica, New York, not Utica, Michigan. And I think Utica, Michigan also had a mental health facility that was either founded or built in like the mid to late 1800s. So I'm sorry if that gets a little confusing. So the facility was built in 1843 at a cost of almost $600,000, and it had a capacity for 600 patients. And it wasn't just housing patients. The Utica Insane Asylum had a working farm. It had gardens where vegetables and flowers were cultivated. It had workshops for tailoring. It had workshops for sewing. It had schools. Theater productions were put on. And a lot of writing was going on. And we'll get to that in a little bit. The hospital did close in 1977, and it now serves as an administrative hospital or administrative center for, I think it's like the New York healthcare system, basically. And that's why we can't definitively say whether Washington Willits went to this facility, because the records are still kept secret for patient anonymity and patient confidentiality. Which is kind of cool, also kind of frustrating for people who have people in their past who have been through this facility. They just kind of want answers. And so one of the important people in the history of the Utica Insane Asylum is Dr. Amariah Brigham. He was the first superintendent of Utica, and he served in that position until his death in 1849. In the 1840s, he launches the American Journal of Insanity, which is now the American Journal of Psychiatry. And it was actually the first English language journal devoted to the topic of what was going on in people's minds and brains. And that really helped cemented the legacy and sort of the premiership of both Dr. Brigham and Utica. He was also the founding member of the Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which eventually becomes the American Psychiatric Association, a much easier name to remember and say. And so if Washington Willits was at the Utica Insane Asylum, we really don't know how much that might have costed the Willits family, but we do know that the journey itself would have been a huge financial undertaking. Just like today, many families, if their child gets sick, they might take that child out of state to see, the best doctor for that disease in the country, even if it's across the United States. In 1850, of course, we don't have direct flights between Birmingham, Michigan, which, was barely a little village, and Utica, New York. But there were the railroad systems. And so here I have a detail of the 1852 railroad map. It was completed by the Treasury by Israel D. Andrews. And here you can see Pontiac is right underneath the A in Michigan. So somewhere around there, there's Birmingham. You could get on the train there and you could, work your way around Lake Erie. And Utica is right under the O in New York. So this is a journey that took a little over a week. So Washington, or Elijah, to take his son Washington to this facility in Utica, New York, he would have had to take off at least 2 weeks from work to, take his son all this way, to get off several stops, switch railroad networks, and he would have had to leave his wife Rachel at home, basically running the entire show, the businesses, the home, managing their children for 2 weeks as well. So this was already kind of a strain on the family. So, and that kind of speaks to, they're well off in matters of pecuniary matters. And so if Washington was here, what was his stay like? What were the patients that were around him? And so life at Utica, we do get a little bit of a picture of this in the 1851 director's report. And this basically lays out everything that was happening at this facility in the year 1850. So basically, how much money was coming in, how much money was going out, how many patients they had, who was leaving, what sort of amusements they were putting on, how many bonnets the women's sewing shop was taking in, all that sort of really, really interesting stuff. And so at Utica, we see in 1850, which if Washington had been at this facility, this is the year we're talking about, they had 800 patients. So they're already a little over the 600 that the facility was originally created for, but not terribly overcrowded yet. And these 800 patients, they are divided into 10 what were called families. And each of these families had their own little suite of rooms in the facility where they had their own cooking facilities, their own sleeping facilities. They had sitting rooms of their own. And really, this really did become like your family at the asylum. These are the people that you would interact with the most. These are the people that you would have seen the most. These are the people that you would have worked with at one of the workshops. These are the people that, if you wrote a piece of poetry that you were going to submit to the Opal, you might have someone in your family proofread that for you. And it does report that year in 1850, there had been a number of people, almost 400, who had been discharged in total. And of that, 171 were listed as recovered or cured, according to, the language of the time. 8 were listed as much improved, 49 improved, 108 unimproved. And if Washington was discharged for being incurable, this probably would have been the category he would have been in. And then 51 patients died. And of those 800, most of these patients are coming from New York and the surrounding area, but intriguingly, 2 are from Michigan, which is really interesting because, if Washington's one, then who's the other? And here we have something different too. We sometimes think of asylums, particularly towards the end of the 1800s and throughout the 1900s, as somewhere where people were basically warehoused for their entire lives, right? You have a child or a teenager who is displaying a mental disability or some mental health problems, and you basically institutionalize them for life. But here at Utica, people are really getting what we would consider outpatient care. And most of the people are only staying here for less than a year. And the longest patient who had been at Utica by 1850 had only been there 6 years. So, very different view of what we might have of asylum life in the 1800s. And fairly close to, if you are having some issues today, you might check yourself into a facility and, maybe stay for a month of care or a couple weeks or however long your insurance will pay for. We're looking at a very similar system. And I'm sure we've all seen those lists that circulate on Facebook every once in a while of like crazy things that people were institutionalized for in the 1800s. Among those were like, reading too many novels or, I don't know, hanging out with poor people too much. But here we really see some things that are very similar to things that people struggle with today. So I have here the pages where the staff are listing the quote, causes of derangement that these people, the patients that they had, what was causing their issues. An interesting choice of words, right? These people are talking about derangement, and that is the same word that is used for Washington Willits in the 1850 census, which could be, just a coincidence, but I think it's really interesting. So, here we have things like drug abuse, alcoholism, being abused by a spouse or a parent, lack of sleep, all these sorts of things that sound very, very normal to us today. We do understand today that, yeah, trauma from childhood can radically change your brain chemistry and how you react to things. Again, in things like head injuries too can completely cause personality shifts. But, one of the saddest things that I think is there's two women on this list that are in this facility for seduction. And at this time, seduction is really a euphemism for having been sexually assaulted. And a lot of times, just like today, the woman is usually blamed for that. So I think that's kind of sad. We also see things that look like, childbirth is listed as one of these things. And, that's today, postpartum depression or psychosis is something that affects a good number of folks out there. But of course, we have our head scratchers, as always. Some of these people were, I think they were really reaching. They were really trying to find reasons for derangement in some of these individuals, and some of them are kind of funny. So like exposure to cold water is listed as a reason, as is like various excitement. So, like excitement from firing a cannon or excitement waiting for a visit from somebody. We also see, oh gosh, I have it listed down, preaching for 16 days and nights straight. We have masturbation, celibacy, study of phrenology, and one person was admitted by their family for being Mormon. And so here we can kind of see like what is considered normative in that society. Like, yeah, you should be having sex, but not too much and not by yourself. And two, you should be religious, but there's limits. You should not be preaching for 6 days straight. Nor should you be, this like new religion that was just coming about. So it's really interesting in this list. We can see things that, today we can definitely be like, oh yeah, like we now know that that can definitely be a symptom. But others are just like, oh, well, that's kind of funny. So now let's talk about the opal. Something that I mentioned earlier, and this is a journal put out by the patients themselves at the institution. And this is one of the most indelible voices that we have from this institution. All the pieces of writing were pseudonyms. It was published quarterly, and it was really outreach for this facility. So it started in 1850, and by 1851, there were 900 subscribers outside of the facility. And so this was a great way for the patients to really, show themselves to the world in the way that they wanted to be seen. And that was just like everyone else. And it was fashioned after other journals of the time. So you have political commentary in it, you have poetry, you have art, you have prose. And one of the most interesting categories is you have patients actually talking about psychological theory and practice. Sometimes they are satirizing or aping the American Journal of Insanity, their sister publication. But other times they are really talking about and diving into the causes of their own mental illness, and the ways that they are being treated at the facility and what seems to be working for them. And that's really interesting to see the patients themselves really grabbing hold and having that authority over over their own mental health care. I find that fascinating. And so, of course, you do see some very glowing reviews in the Opal as to the facility and the care that folks are being given. But we also see some veiled criticisms, which I find very, very interesting. So in one of those, we find people are talking about how they feel like zoo animals when the asylum gets visitors. At this time, throughout the 1850s, the Utica Insane Asylum is getting about 100,000 visitors a year. And visiting asylums was a very popular pastime. You could pay, sometimes a small amount of money to basically walk through an asylum and gawk at both the patients within it and what they were doing. Sometimes these visitors would be elected officials, making sure that, taxpayer funds were being spent wisely. But a lot of times it was just normal, everyday people. And the patients complained that they felt like zoo animals.
Yeah.
And another one comes out in their political commentary. It seems like most of the doctors and um, staff, and also the patients at the facility were anti-slavery and abolitionists. And I've gone ahead of myself again. Um, they were anti-slavery and they were abolitionists. But the patients really saw parallels between their treatment and those of the enslaved. Just like the enslaved, they didn't have the bodily autonomy to go where they wanted to, when they wanted to, go out to the shops and spend, the money that they had if they wanted, a new pair of, socks or something like that. They didn't have the autonomy to enter into contracts, whether that be a marriage contract, whether that be, buying a piece of property. They didn't have their own bodily autonomy. Um, and so I find that really interesting too, that these people are not only commenting on current events in their own world and kind of things that are happening outside of them, but they're really like doing, some pretty sophisticated work in drawing parallels between the different positions too. And some at the end of it, the writers come to this, understanding like, oh, well, this is for my own good. It's only going to be a couple years here. That's fine. And others are striking a much more defiant tone. And one of those things where they're kind of striking a defiant tone is in matters of bodily autonomy. So I have here on this slide a snippet from a poem written by, we can presume, a young man by the pseudonym that it's written under, but it's a poem about beautiful young women. You're going out in the world and you see some beautiful young women and you find them attractive. And quote, find most sure when 'tis quite too late that aid in finding a mate. Vexations deep will poison their way. Admittance warm they'll get for their pay. Admittance here is a euphemism for a device that the staff would strap to the hands of patients to prevent them from masturbating. And this person is really calling out like the loss of bodily autonomy that patients at the facility have, that they would not have if they weren't in this facility. And even though the moral treatment movement was really at the forefront of not chaining people up, really minimal constraints, they still thought that they had to stop people from hurting themselves or hurting others. So straitjackets were used, and one of the things that they innovated was what was called the Utica crib. And I have a photo here of it. It looks like a crib, but it has a lid. And this was to restrain the patient from, again, either hurting themselves or others. And it basically forces the patient into a laying position, and you can't really move from that position where you're laying on your back. It was thought that this would cause the person to become relaxed, become more compliant. Isolation was also used instead of punching or kicking to to make the patients do what they wanted to do. If a patient didn't obey, they might be sent to isolation. At the time, that was considered a very humane way to dole out punishment. Nowadays, we know that isolation, even in a very mentally healthy person, can be a form of torture. And obviously, if you were claustrophobic, the Utica crib would also not help your mental health care very much. And so the opal runs until 1860. And the reason why it stops is a decline in the moral treatment movement. So the fall of the moral treatment movement really comes about in the late 1800s. And that is because a lot of people are looking at these directors' reports, and they're looking at the output of these asylums, and they're realizing that there's a lot of people that have not been cured by these institutions. And they were promised that all this insanity can be cured. And so people were really starting to become really cynical towards the moral treatment movement and these institutions. So taxpayer funding dropped off significantly, which meant that there were fewer staff at these institutions. However, more and more people were being put into these systems and into these institutions. Part of that was the Industrial Revolution, where more and more people were coming from these rural communities to these cities, and they were leaving behind sometimes their families and their communities and their support systems. And if anything were to happen to these people, they did have, say, a mental health episode or a crisis. Instead of being able to rely on family and their community, a lot of times these people were put into asylums. And another thing was the rise of eugenics and racial science. And racial science, in quote, it's not a science, but they were really trying to say that different races had different varying degrees of mental abilities. And the eugenics movement really understood mental illness as this is something that can be inherited. And in order to, increase the good genes in society, people with bad genes need to be taken out of the gene pool. Now, you can do this negative eugenics, which is to literally unalive these people and take them out of the gene pool, or positive eugenics, which is you're either going to sterilize these people or put them in an asylum for the rest of their lives. So this is really where we start to see people being institutionalized for life and sometimes living their entire lives in an institution like the Utica Insane Asylum. By the 1880s, newspapers are widely reporting on the patients that were being abused and killed at Utica. And here I have a picture of Nellie Bly. Many of you will be familiar with her and her work. She is a pioneering female journalist. And one of her first big stories that she did is she went undercover in a mental health facility for women in New York. And she basically had herself admitted, and then she had a heck of a time trying to get out. People on the outside really had to fight to get her released from this facility. And she writes this damning expose about the conditions there. And as I'm giving this talk right now, we are just a week or two out from Britney Spears's memoir, where she's talking about her life and experience in conservatorship, which is another way that we as a society have tried to control mental illness and the mentally ill and really protect themselves and their assets and everything else. And so we're right now in a societal reckoning where we're like, well, what are the safeguards in place? Like, yeah, we think this system is good because we think it's helping people, but what if it isn't? And we're still dealing with a lot of these questions as to, what mental health care should look like. How much agency do we give to the person in this system who may be struggling or having a crisis at the time? How much autonomy do we give them? And, how can we best treat them like the human being that they are and not view them as inherently violent or lazy or animal-like? So I really think Washington Willits's life and untimely death is a really interesting way that we can kind of access the different ways that mental health care has been addressed throughout our history. We like to think of history as this just like progress, starting at a state of barbarity, and we're getting more and more enlightened all the time, and things are getting better and better. And sometimes it does work that way, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there is a backlash or there's a backsliding. And we see that with the moral treatment movement and how mental health care changed for the worse after that. And in some ways, we're kind of right back to where we were in the mental health care or the moral treatment movement, which is interesting. And I hope, and I think everyone else here hopes, that we don't go backwards and we continue to move forwards. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Before I address any questions or comments, I want to talk about our upcoming lectures. All of our lectures here are talking about topics and people that we talk about in our current exhibit, which is called A Tapestry of Birmingham, Exploring Our Diversity. Our next talk is January 11th, where my colleague Justin Cook will be talking about how immigration shaped Birmingham. And then in February, I am back and I am talking about how Cream Magazine talked about the civil rights movements of the 1970s and 1980s. I love Cream Magazine. It is a rock and roll magazine, recently relaunched, very interesting. So I think that's going to be really fun. And then in March, another colleague of mine is talking about the Prindle sisters. And you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and if you cannot get enough of my voice, I am the host of the Birmingham Museum's podcast, Birmingham Uncovered, available on YouTube, our website, and wherever else fine podcasts live. So thank you again, and I am going to open it up for questions. Oh, thank you, Nancy. She says, excellent presentation, very informative. And you can also raise your hand and speak up too if you don't wish to type anything in the chat. All right. Cool.
I just wanted to also applaud you for your thorough explanation and insight on that. I did come in late. I'm also someone, I've lived in Birmingham for 12 years now, and have been hospitalized in the psychiatric unit over 20 times. So I definitely relate to the limitation in personal autonomy. And actually, it's heavily medication based. So if you don't take the medication, you're not able to get treated properly, and they force court orders and other aspects to really demand the pharmaceutical industry to be involved with the mental health system quite a bit. I also relate to the because I've never been someone that tries to harm myself or anyone else, or limited in access to or risk of loss of shelter, food, or water. But for some reason, there just needs to be some type of improvement to allow more personal autonomy and how treatment happens. The other thing I want to mention is that they also don't allow touching. And I think you also mentioned that isolation doesn't just hurt mentally ill people or whatever we want to call it, but also affects everyone. So the fact that you're shut off from your entire community and you can't talk about things and process things with people that love you and love them back, it makes it very difficult to really properly understand how a person actually is. Because if someone just talked to me through it, then I would not go into psychosis. But since there's no one available at the time, or not really sure, because in the state of confusion, you just, need more support than usual. So just really want to applaud you for all the insight, because there hasn't been much changes since the 1800s.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I really appreciate that. And yeah, kind of one of the things that you talk about too is not having your outside friends and family be able to reach out and to touch and to talk about. And that was something that also comes up in the pages of the Opal that I didn't quite have time to work in, but a lot of the outside subscribers were friends and family of the patients there, and they weren't allowed to visit the facility very often to see their loved ones. So sometimes you will see kind of these veiled things in these poems and in these letters and things, and you're wondering, is this someone trying to reach out to someone back home? So yeah, I mean, there is so much, I think, and so much more that we have to do in order to help people and help them, not only get through whatever they're currently going through, but to be able to thrive. So thank
Yeah.
you again for sharing your
Is it
experiences.
possible to make another comment?
Yeah, sure.
Um, in this most recent hospitalization in October, there's something that you mentioned that I wanted to comment on, and I actually lost my train of thought on that. So I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not.
Oh, that's okay. I do that often too. So
Um, yeah.
So something that did come up in the chat is from Jerry. Fascinating, similar story at Annie's Ghost has connections to Michigan's Eloise and mental incarcerations at Northville in northern Michigan. And the author is Steve Luxembourg. So yeah, great. There was a lot going on in mental health care, both during this time and afterwards. And like I said, like the line between insane and idiotic was physician to physician and sometimes facility to facility, and how the facilities instituted, their own version of moral treatment, sometimes fluctuated as well. So again, if you come across different accounts from people, they were either in these different facilities or have friends or family members in them, you might find very different accounts. And so I don't want to say that what was happening at Utica was broadly representative of things that were happening anywhere else. This is just, one particular slice of that story. So any other questions or comments? All right, fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for coming out today and making some time in your busy schedules to come out and experience this with us. Oh, Pretty came back in the chat, and she said it is a known fact that drugs can cause more issues than they help, and that is certainly true. Everyone's brain chemistries and bodily chemistries are very different, and yeah, sometimes what can help someone can also just like wreck someone's mental health even more. So that is also something to keep in mind when people are sharing their own experiences. What might help me in my battle against depression might not be the tool that everyone should use.